Hello, I'm Dango Rose. Welcome to the Mountaineer Podcast, where everybody's listening. The Mountaineer brings you the latest news of the Peak to Peak region, in print, online, through our podcast, social media, and special publications. Now, listen in to the latest news of the area with our local journalists.
The song that you are currently listening to is called Just Keep It Real, and it's performed by Howard Dlugas. You can stream the entire song now on his SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Howard-Dlugas. And if you want to see Howard Dlugas performing live, you can catch him very soon at the Canyon Tavern. More details coming up later in the podcast.
Wide open. Time is on your side. You can't rely on intuition. Still water from deep inside.
Hello! My name is Jamie Lammers, and welcome to a very special surprise retrospective episode of the Mountaineer Podcast. I know I said I'd only be doing these on Wednesdays for the foreseeable future, but there's a reason why we're airing this particular episode now. This week's musician in the physical edition of the Mountaineer is a man by the name of Howard Dlugas, who is performing at the Canyon Tavern very soon. However, he made it very clear to me that he did not want his interview aired on the podcast, so to respect his wishes, we're going to do something else this week. We're going to air some interviews that I have been incredibly excited to share with all of you guys since I actually conducted them, but that I have not found the time to actually release. I am beyond excited to share these two interviews with you this week, but I did want to give Howard Dlugas his due. He was involved in a band that had a successful Billboard charting single back in the early 2000s, and he's also currently involved in a production company called Morning Moon Productions, which is involved with various aspects of film and music production, including behind-the-scenes work on a movie called Wildflower, which you can stream on Hulu now. If you want to learn more about the backstory of Howard Dlugas, be sure to check out this week's edition of The Mountaineer. And if you want to see Howard Dlugas performing live, you can catch him at the Canyon Tavern, 32138 Highway 72 in Coal Creek Canyon on Saturday, July 13th, 2024, starting at 6 p.m. You can also check out his original music on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Howard-Dlugas. But like I said, instead of his interview this week, we're going to be airing two interviews that I was incredibly gutted that I couldn't air at the time that I actually conducted them. So, I am so glad to say that this week's subjects are Harry Tuft and John McEuen. Both of these musicians have incredibly storied careers when it comes to the people that they've met and the music that they performed and released over the years. But both of them also have a connection to the Peak to Peak area. Harry Tuft performed at the United Center many times. In fact, I actually wrote a column about him back in October of 2023. And John McEuen was responsible for founding the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, who actually came to the Caribou Ranch to record some music. I am incredibly excited to finally release these interviews on the podcast, and I also have another special surprise for you guys. Not only will you be getting the audio component of this episode, but because Harry can be hard to hear in certain parts of the first part of his interview, you will also be getting a transcript to the full episode. Usually, we don't do transcriptions for the Mountaineer Podcast. One, because it would take a lot more manpower, and two, because we've never actually tested the feature before. But I figured that this episode was incredibly important to get a transcript out for because the historical reach of this particular episode goes far beyond the Peak to Peak area, so you will be getting a transcript for this episode as well. I have manually typed it out for this episode. So be sure to check out the transcript if you didn't understand something that was mentioned in this episode. Alright, enough delays. Let's get into the final episode. Our first guest! Do you mind introducing yourself real quick?
My name is Harry Tuft, and I live in Denver. For many years ran a store called the Denver Folklore Center. I've been involved with a wonderful folk organization called Swallow Hill Music Association. And these days I am mostly retired, but I have sort of a second occupation as a singer and musician.
And you were performing at the United Center when I I conducted this interview, weren't you?
Yes, I am. I'm performing with Rich Moore and with a group that I'm a part of called Grubstake. And our concert is October the 28th, a Saturday evening in Idaho Springs at the Center. And I'm looking forward to it.
Just so you know, the other members of Grubstake will be shouted out later in this episode. But for now, let's talk about you, Harry. What's your musical journey been?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Philadelphia in a Jewish family, and typical of Jewish families, the parents like to involve the kids in music. And so at an early age, I started to take piano lessons, and then a little later on, clarinet lessons. And through a counselor at a summer camp, I saw a thing called a ukulele, which seemed really interesting. And I started to play the ukulele, which led to the baritone ukulele, and eventually added the 2 strings to a baritone, which makes it into a 6-string guitar. But music was in my life and in my family life. My father was a real audiophile. He loved classical music and opera, and every night at dinner we would have music, mostly the traditional classical composers, Beethoven and Mozart and folks like that. So I had music in the house, but up in my room on the 3rd floor I had a radio, and I've always been a late night person, so I would listen to the pop stations of the day, but I also listened to the R&B stations as well. And I love to sing, so I would find myself singing along to a lot of the songs of what we now call Great American Songbook. But to me, they were just the popular songs of the day. My favorites were particularly Nat King Cole and Joe Stafford, Perry Como, and I liked them because they sang straight. Folks like Frank Sinatra, who liked to be creative with his style, were not as interesting to me somehow. So music has really always been in the forefront for me, although my father was a doctor and he wanted me to be a doctor. So when I went to college, I went into a pre-med program, which ultimately really didn't work. Then in the late 50s, having graduated from the baritone ukulele to the guitar in the senior year at college, there was a folk song club that had been started that I joined, and they had invited Pete Seeger to a concert that I was able to help out with and attend, and really that got me started. And my mother's influence was also interesting in that she sent me an album, 10-inch album on folkways by a guy named Leadbelly, and I put it on the turntable and I took it off right away. I thought it was terrible. Couldn't understand the words or anything. Well, it took me about 6 months and 2 more tries until I got the beauty of Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, known by a lot of folks for a couple of songs that got quite popular, one called Goodnight Irene and the other called Midnight Special. And that really got me off into the blues. I learned about Big Bill Brunsey from 3 Frenchmen in a Paris record shop who were amazed that I, as an American, didn't know who Big Bill Brunsey was. And when I got back to Philadelphia and graduating from college in the late 50s, there was a coffee house there called Gilded Cage, and every Sunday they had a thing they called a hootenanny. Hootenanny was also, I guess, not yet popular on TV, but they called it a hootenanny, and it was really a song circle. And I started to play there and learn songs, and rapidly my attention was turning away from education, or I had already given up on medicine and I was in graduate school in architecture, and I pretty much gave up on that and decided to travel out to Colorado because I'd skied in college, and I thought maybe I could make a living playing in the bars and skiing and playing in the bars and ski areas. And that sort of worked out. I mostly worked in restaurants and I didn't get a whole lot of chance to ski and practically no chance to actually make music. But it got me out in this area. I came out here first in 1960, got the idea to open a store here from a wonderful guy named Hal Newstetter, who ran a club in Denver called the Exodus. He thought that a folklore center in Denver might be a good part-time thing. So I traveled around for a year and came back, and long story short, I actually opened the Denver Folklore Center in 1962. So I put my music secondary to the business of running a store. And I ran it for 50 years, being able to play music. Then about 10 years into it, I was able to get together with 2 fellas to do some music, and we eventually started a group called Grubstake. And as Grubstake, we were together for over 40 years. One of the fellas was having some physical problems and felt it was time to take a break, so we didn't do anything for a couple of years. And then just recently we were part of a benefit for a wonderful woman who had been instrumental in keeping Swallow Hill alive. And so we did a few songs there, and I realized that if it was okay with the other two fellas, we could be a part of this concert up in Idaho Springs. So, in fact, that is what's going to happen. So Grubstake will do a set, and then Rich Moore will accompany me. We'll do a set and hopefully be entertaining.
It was at this point I asked Harry Tuft what his experience writing songs was like.
Well, I'm not a songwriter.
So that means you primarily perform covers?
These days they call them covers, yeah. I used to say I do OPS, I do other people's songs. Somewhere along the way the label cover, so I guess you would say I do covers. But I also learned a lot of music, as I mentioned, out of the Great American Songbook. They were just songs of the day when I was growing up in the 50s. And by the 60s, when I got involved with folk music, I just gave up on those songs. And mostly I was taken with traditional folk, and I was really into the traditional side. The only non-traditional person I respected was Woody Guthrie. He was the only writer. And I was that way until this guy named Bob Dylan came along. And so I began to change my ways. And then in 1964, a man named Manny Greenhill called the store and introduced himself, and I knew his name from the magazines of the day. And he said that he was the manager of Joan Baez and wanted to bring her to Denver. Would I be interested in promoting her in a concert? And I said, well, man, you got two problems. One, I've never promoted a concert, and two, I don't have any money. And he said, well, as far as the first, I'll walk you through it. And second, I'll put up any money that's needed for deposits, and then I'll give you 10% of the gross. Well, at the time, Joan Baez was the reigning folk princess of the day, and I said, okay, I would do it. And so I arranged a concert at the Denver Auditorium Theater. It's now been turned into the L.E. Calkins Theater, but at the time, and it seated 2,200. Well, I sold it out, and that started me on a series of promotions that were really wonderful to do and helpful to the bottom line of my store. So when Joan Baez came in 1964 in March, she arrived by train. She didn't like planes. And she arrived alone, no entourage. But while we were driving around, she was looking from the two rock and roll stations, Kim and KBTR. She's trying to find Beatles songs. And here was this reigning folk princess who was enamored of the Beatles. And I thought that was just amazing and crazy. But it also opened up my eyes to the Beatles, and by that time I sort of was on my way to appreciating a lot of the American singer-songwriters, Tom Paxton and Eric Anderson, and later on Leonard Cohen and Randy Newman, wonderful writers, Steve Goodman, and then later even than that, the writers that came out of Austin, Texas, Guy Clark and Lyle Lovett. And so my repertoire these days includes all of those things. And then, about 10 years ago, I suddenly realized that all these songs that were sitting in the back of my head that were these Great American Songbook songs were really pretty good songs. And so I actually started to try to play them. I play the guitar. I just play it to accompany myself. I just love to sing. And so my arrangements of those wonderfully more complicated arrangements of songs in their original, I would do in a sort of more folky way, but it seemed to work pretty well. And then, going on maybe almost a decade ago, Rich Moore and I started to do things together. And of course, Rich, who is a wonderfully accomplished guitarist, could add those great chords to some of those songs. So that's how things have evolved. Grubstake is pretty much a folky group. We do songs that are generally not known. We don't do the pop folk songs, but all our songs are, we hope and we think, entertaining and interesting, and many of them are ballads. We love ballads. And then Rich and I do a wide variety of things, anywhere from the Great American Songbook to rhythm and blues to folk. So it makes for, hopefully, a pretty entertaining evening.
What stuck out to you about choosing which songs from the Great American Songbook you wanted to perform?
Sure. Well, I think it's a combination. The ones that I enjoy always have an interesting, not always lovely, but an interesting melody. And they almost always tell some sort of a story. Although, of course, a lot of them are love songs, and the story is really just very often unrequited love. But I also have a fascination for chords and unusual uses of chords. The Beatles were incredible in the way they thought of chordal arrangements, putting different chords in where other folks might have put them. And so I'm a sucker for a story, and I'm a sucker for a melody. And when you put those together, it just comes out really well. I got into Nat King Cole when he was accompanied by a large orchestra, Nelson Riddle, and his biggest hits were with a large orchestra. But I learned about the King Cole Trio, which preceded those hits, and realized that Nat King Cole was an incredible player, and some of those songs are wonderful. So I do a couple of songs out of the trio, one called Straighten Up and Fly Right, another one called Frim Fram Sauce. And I also, on an album that I made a while back, do a song that I actually learned from one of those R&B stations in the 50s called Mint Julep. So I like lots of different kinds of songs, but I also know and can sing without any sheet music a number of ballads that go anywhere from 8 to 12 verses, just because I love the stories that are involved.
Keep in mind, this guy, who basically just said that he still memorizes songs that are 8 to 12 verses long, is almost 90 years old. I couldn't help but keep the Joan Baez story in mind after being completely floored by it, and I had to ask, who else did you promote back in the day?
Well, since Manny also handled Pete Seeger, I brought Pete Seeger, and then there was another wonderful promoter, manager out of New York City. Manny was out of Boston, named Harold Leventhal, and Harold managed Judy Collins and Arlo Guthrie and Pete Seeger in one part of the country. So I brought Judy Collins here. I did a promotion with Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie. Harold and I were talking, and he called and he asked, how would Pete Seeger do at Red Rocks? I said, well, he would be okay, but he would sell out. He said, what about Arlo Guthrie? I said, same. He said, what about the two of them? I said, well, some called sellout for those. And so I put on the first concert that the two of them did together, and I brought them twice. And I also brought Baez here 5 times, first to the Auditorium Theater, 3 times to Red Rocks, and 1 time to the Auditorium Arena. And Baez, at the time, the first time I brought her to Red Rocks, wanted to meet the Beatles, so I scheduled a concert 2 days after the Beatles concert and was able to work it out so that she could meet the Beatles. And I was fortunate enough to stand in the back of the dressing room and watch the 4 of them interact with Baez, which was probably the most outstanding memory that I guess. If I were to ask, what is one memory that you had? It was that experience. And then when they went on stage, we went, and basically we were backstage, but we walked out to the edge of the stage almost, and we looked back at the Beatles, and we couldn't hear them because even though the speaker was right above us, the screams of the kids, mostly girls, were so loud that they drowned out any sort of sound, and it was almost physical. You could almost feel the energy penetrate your body. It was pretty incredible. I also brought the Mamas and Papas to the Auditorium Arena. I did a series of concerts at the Auditorium Theater with a folk group by the name of Ian and Sylvia, a bluegrass group, Earl Scruggs, a Ravi Shankar, a wonderful Indian sitar master, and the Charles Lloyd Quartet, and that was spaced 6 weeks apart over several months. I did a love-in on the west bank of the Natural History Museum, what now is called the Museum of Nature and Science, with the Grateful Dead and Captain Beefheart and some local groups. So I had a chance to do promotions that were really enjoyable.
That is absolutely incredible. And through bringing all of these artists to perform at venues in Colorado and sharing your own music and sharing all of these songs from the Great American Songbook, what has stuck out to you most about performing live and sharing all of that music with an audience?
Nothing beats a live audience. I started more than 20 years ago doing a once-a-month hootenanny at Swallow Hill. We called it an old-fashioned hootenanny, but really was what we now call an open mic or an open stage. And I did that up until the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, I switched to doing it as a Zoom performance, and I continue to do that. So we have anywhere from 20 to 30 folks who are willing to open up and do one song. It's sort of like a Zoom open stage, kind of. And then for a number of years now, I've done a cafe series where I invite one other guest that I call Harry Ann. I've had lots of different folks, and in fact, the next one coming up at Swallow Hill on October 19th is a wonderful guitarist by the name of Pat Donahue. So I still keep my hand in, and I love it. Nothing beats being able to stand in front of a group of people and engage them in the music, either in listening or hopefully sometimes joining in. I love to do songs that are familiar to people, and I think I can imagine that someone like Taylor Swift, who has thousands in an arena of people who know all her songs, who stops singing and just lets the audience sing. I can't imagine that it's not the greatest reward that she gets out of performing, to have that kind of a response from the audience. And I don't think there's anything that beats it.
And is there anything in particular you hope that people will be able to take away from your shows when they come and see you?
I'm a big believer in what makes up a community, and it can be all different kinds of communities. I was fortunate enough to be able to help establish Swallow Hill, and Swallow Hill has a wonderful community. I've been a part of lots of other kinds of communities, including the folks around Idaho Springs and Georgetown and Silver Plume. And the first musician I met in Colorado was a fellow named George Downing. And George and I were friends from that first week in December of 1960 until he died some years ago. George did a melodrama in Silver Plume for over 30 years. And they were all newly written every year. I think he did 34 of them. And George inspired a whole community of players and listeners up and down that, whatever you might call that valley, anywhere between Idaho Springs and Silver Plume. I actually got married in Idaho Springs, but that's another story. And so I always think of it as returning to Idaho Springs as being the area that I first came to, and it holds a very special place in my heart.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I would say that I really love to sing. I've been really fortunate to have been able to find audiences that are willing to come and share my music, and particularly blessed with the association with Jack Stanesco and Steve Abbott in the group Grub Stake, and delighted that we're able to reform to do some music. Making music, for me, there's nothing like it. It's just wonderful. I think I've probably bent your ear long enough.
But I wasn't done bending his ear quite yet. Funnily enough, around the time that I conducted this interview, my dad had gotten into a tangent online where he started watching concerts from none other than Arlo Guthrie and Pete Seeger. I was very surprised that I was talking to the man who brought them together in the first place.
The second time that I brought them, there actually was a recording truck from the Wally Hyder Studios in LA that recorded the concert, and apparently the truck followed them to several concerts. And I don't think that the Red Rocks one made it into the recording, but there's actually a double album of Pete and Arlo that came out of that tour.
In case you're curious, the Red Rocks Park and Amphitheater website, redrocksonline.com, officially lists the event of Arlo Guthrie and Pete Seeger at Red Rocks as having taken place on Friday, August 16th, 1974. And in 1975, the album Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie Together in Concert was released. I also told Harry that I thought I remembered that Pete Seeger at one point played with his family, although I told him I could have been thinking of something else.
Maybe something else, because mostly out of both of their families, I mean, Arlo later on did stuff, I think, with his wife and daughter. In those earlier days, it was just the two of them. I actually was quite friendly with Arlo's first accompanist, who actually came from Philadelphia, whom I knew in Philadelphia, and was a wonderful guy who died way too young. Anyway, that was a connection that I had to Arlo. I've been fortunate enough to be kind of a transmitter of songs for some of the artists. I got to know Judy Collins pretty well and would, on pretty frequent occasion, send her songs that I thought were interesting, some of which she ended up adding to her repertoire. I actually sent a song to Arlo that was a Dylan song called Percy Song that he was looking for. And early on in New York City, I was friendly with a fellow named Dick Weissman, with whom I'm still friendly. And he was forming a group with two other guys called the Journeymen, and I was traveling from Philly to New York on weekends, and the other two guys were John Phillips and Scott McKenzie, and John Phillips later became Papa John of the Mamas and Papas, and we would sit around and sing songs. I sang all these songs that I'd learned from kind of a mentor of mine in Philadelphia, and sure enough, some of those songs ended up in John's repertoire, so I felt good that I was a bit of a transmitter of songs.
What I may have actually been thinking of is a performance that happened much later later with Arlo Guthrie and Pete Seeger with the Guthrie family at Carnegie Hall in NYC on November 30th, 2013, which you can actually find on the YouTube channel BDM. To be honest, I couldn't even stop bending Harry's ear after we finished this interview, which was conducted on October 2nd, 2023. No, I had to call him again for more clarification on a certain story. Remember how he said he got married in Idaho Springs and that was a story for another time? Well, it's another time, and frankly, if no one else is, I'm curious about it. So I called him again yesterday, June 27th, 2024, to talk to him again about that particular story. To hear more about Harry Tuft and to hear John McEuen, stay tuned after the ad break. Self-defense does not require athleticism. It just requires determination and a desire to learn. If you want to feel empowered, confident, self-assured, and safe while learning self-defense, then head over to Nederland Defensive Arts at the Nederland Community Center. To learn more, contact Sensei Carl Zondrecker at carlzondrecker@gmail.com or by calling 518-637-3106. Also be sure to check out a recent podcast episode promoting the school. Music credits will be given at the end of the episode.
June, or like some musical instrument that's just been laid by tune. Perhaps it's a trip to a foreign land.
Welcome back, and now to continue with Harry Tuft. Are you all right with talking about your marriage in Idaho Springs?
Okay. Well, when I came out to Colorado for the first time, I had been given a tip on places where I could work, and one of them was in Georgetown, and that was actually the first place I went to. It was a place called the Holy Cat, run by Phil in Elise, Maine, and I went in and said I was a folk singer looking for work, and he said, come back Monday, you're hired. It was as easy as that, and my hope was to be able to make music. As it turned out, mostly what I did was wash dishes, wait tables, run the bar, and then if all of that was taken care of, then I would have a chance to make some music. It was really not the setup that I had hoped would be, but it was a way to get into Colorado. That was in December of 1960, and I was there for about a month. And a girl, we were pretty young at that point, that I had gone with in Philadelphia, where I'm from, but had broken up with, found out that I had come out to Colorado, and she made her way out here to follow me. Well, I'd been here for a month and probably feeling kind of lonely, so she wanted to stay, and I said, okay. But the problem with the two of us staying together, we couldn't afford two places, and we could not rent even a room or an apartment as an unmarried couple in Colorado in 1960. So I was working at the Holy Cat, and she had work, I forget exactly where actually, but I think it was in Idaho Springs. And we both worked until late in the evening, but I went to a justice of the peace on Colorado Avenue in Idaho Springs and asked him if he would marry us at a late evening time, and he agreed. So that's what we did. I picked Jackie up and we drove to Idaho Springs, and we got married by this justice of the peace. Kind of unceremoniously, I guess you would say. And in those days, living together, as you can tell by the story, was not common. And while we would have been fine with it, the world around us was not. We stayed together. We went from Denver to Aspen, worked in Aspen, went from Aspen to South Toledo and Mill Valley, California. And by the summer, by August, our relationship had deteriorated such that we went back to Philadelphia and separated. And that was my first marriage of about 8 months.
Do you mind if I ask if the split was amicable? If you guys kept in contact after that?
No, it was not a happy separation. I was the one who wanted the separation. She did not. So it was not very amicable. And eventually it got dissolved or divorced. But she stayed in Philadelphia. I came back to Denver, and I'd gotten the idea from Hal Newstetter, who ran the Exodus Folk Club in Denver, that maybe a folklore center of the kind that was in the village would be something that a person could make a part-time living on. And having had that idea and not having any real prospect for anything else, and I was still on a leave of absence from graduate school in architecture, but I could see that that future was not going to work for me. So as a result, I decided that I would return to Denver, which I did, and started the Denver Folklore Center.
Am I allowed to ask how many marriages you've had?
Only 2.
And are you currently married?
No, I'm not. My second wife and I amicably divorced, but remained friends. And we have 2 daughters. The 4 of us travel together, and we have an uncommonly good relationship. And we lived separately in Denver, and now she lives in Chicago. But we meet up. A couple of years ago, I flew to Chicago. We took the City of New Orleans train down to New Orleans to the New Orleans Jazz Festival. And I feel very fortunate that we have had a very good relationship, that we're really very, very, very good friends and understand each other quite well. We were together for 29 years before we separated. And so the family that is able to stay together as we have is really better off. I don't think anybody would dispute that.
I felt kind of bad focusing on Harry's personal life for so long, so I wanted to switch back to the Denver Folklore Center, because I read online, admittedly on Wikipedia, that Harry initially owned and founded the Denver Folklore Center, then sold it, then bought it back, then ultimately moved on. And I wanted to ask him if that was true.
Yes, that's true. Well, I started the store in 1962. By 1979, it was really not profitable. I had gotten folks together to start Swallow Hill using the concert hall and the school. Both of those entities I had developed over the years. So Swallow Hill was able to continue, but I closed the retail aspect from that location on 17th Avenue. At the same time, my repair shop manager, Rick Kirby, wanted to continue. So I gave him the inventory and the name, and he opened up on South Broadway, where he tried to make a go of it for 3 years. And when it was clear that it was not going to go any longer, I came back in, paid off the debts, and reclaimed the name. Swallow Hill had been in that building as well when that entity closed in 82 or 83. Swallow Hill continued finding places to work from in order to do concerts and instruction, eventually coming to South Pearl Street and Jewel Avenue in South Pearl. After 10 years of doing other things, I decided to reopen the store and found a location just across the street from Swallow Hill, which seemed like a good idea. And so that was in 93 that I started the Folklore Center up again. In the interim, a couple of other similar kinds of stores had opened that also had a pretty good run, one of which is the Old Town Pick-and Parlor in Old Town, Arvada, run by Kit Simon, and it continues to this day. And Kit's is mostly an instrument shop, whereas my shop started as a real folk shop with not just instruments, but recordings and books and accessories and lessons, things like that. And as the world turned more toward guitars as a business, my shop became more of a guitar shop. And when I did finally sell it in 2016 to Saul Rosenthal and Claude Brockfeld, it really was essentially a guitar shop, and it was a guitar shop that they were most interested in having.
So I assume that your primary focuses right now are Swallow Hill and your music career.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't do anything more at Swallow Hill than the performances that I do, although I'm available for any consulting or any ideas that people seem valuable and ask me for. But it is a wonderfully run organization that has done incredibly well over the years. So I turned my attention to performing, really. And the other thing is I accumulated an awful lot of stuff over the years. I used the store as a repository for that stuff. Ended up with a couple of storage units, which I worked pretty steadily at trying to lower down. And I'm actually having an event in July coming up next month on the 28th that's based on the fact that a friend of mine who wanted to support a portrait artist had the artist make a portrait of me at Swallow Hill. And on the 28th, we're going to have the dedication of the portrait. I'm going to bring a lot of the stuff that relates to Swallow Hill and the Folklore Center to that event to give away, and then we'll have a song circle, folks sticking around just to play some music. There'll be in a StoryCorps kind of a booth for people who care to talk about sort of the old days. To do that, we can archive some of those memories, and that should be an enjoyable afternoon.
And I assume the show that you talked about in the previous interview is also still going on.
Yeah, Harry Ann starts up again in the fall, in September. We'll try to do about 5 a year, and yeah, I'm still negotiating for my September artist, but I'll announce it as soon as I have it nailed down, so to speak. And I still do Zoom Hoot. There'll be another Zoom Hoot a week from tomorrow that I do with any performers who'd like to come online and play a song, sometimes 2 songs.
I wanted to clarify something that happened during this second interview. During this second interview, I gave a bit of a prelude that didn't end up making it into this episode. But the way I introduced him, it sounded like I said his name was Harry Tufts with a plural instead of Harry Tuft as a singular. Now, I did not say Harry Tufts, but the way it came through in the phone, it definitely sounded like I did. So I just wanted to clarify that, especially since it sets up this joke.
I answer to anything, particularly if it's lunchtime.
Thank you so much to Harry for coming on board and joining us for the podcast, not once, but twice, even though this is the first time we're in either interview. You can check out the article that I wrote for him promoting his show at the United Center with Rich Moore and Grubstake in the October 12th, 2023 edition of The Mountain Ear. You can also see more of him online. I found a couple of different things from him, even though I believe his website, harrytuft.com, is officially taken down. I found an interview from him with the National Association of Music Merchants, and I found out that he was inducted into the Colorado Music Hall of Fame on February 12th, 2012. You can find tons of stuff like this online. Just search for Harry Tuft. I'm sure you'll find some of that stuff. In 1976, he released an album called Across the Blue Mountains, which is actually available at least on Spotify. I have not been able to find his other albums online. Grubstake from 1977, Favorite Folk Songs minus Guitar, and his brand new Harry Tuft and Friends album, Treasures Untold. However, I do have a copy of Treasures Untold, so I'm sure you can find it somewhere online wherever CDs are sold. Before we get into the next interview, it's time for this week's Music Mentions. I'm going to change up the scheduling of these music mentions just a smidge more once again. Saturdays and Sundays will now be mentioned a week ahead of schedule. So, hopefully, the most last minute you'll have to prepare is 3 days ahead of time instead of just 1 day ahead of time. Now, let's get into this week's music mentions. Head to Busey Brews, located at 70 East 1st Street in Netherland on Sunday, June 30th at 2 p.m. to see Troy Yannel performing live, on Friday, July 5th at 4 p.m. to see the Nippers of the Lowdown performing live, and on Sunday, July 7th at 2 p.m. to see Eric Richard Stone performing live. Head to the Canyon Tavern, located 32138 Highway 72 in Coal Creek Canyon on Saturday, June 29th at 5 p.m. to see Scrapyard Izzy performing live, and on Saturday, July 6th at 6 p.m. to see Derek Hall performing live. Head to the Gold Hill Inn, located at 401 Main Street in Gold Hill on Saturday, June 29th at 5:30 p.m. to see Porphyry performing live, on Sunday, June 30th at 6 p.m. to see Daniel Rodriguez and his band performing live, on Thursday, July 4th, starting at noon, for the 4th of July Twang Fest and Barbecue 2024, which features performances from the Patty Fiasco, Greg Shockett and Little America, and the Powder Valley Playboys. Cash at the door, no advance tickets, $25 cash for music, $20 more for food. Half price for kids under 12. The event lasts until 5 p.m. Also be sure to head there on Saturday, July 6th at 5:30 p.m. to see New Family Dog performing live, and on Sunday, July 7th at 6 p.m. to see Paul McDonald and the Morning Doves performing live. We were unable to let you know last week that this weekend, New Family Dog is performing at the Grand Z Casino Hotel, located at 321 Gregory Street in Central City. That's today, Friday, June 28th, starting at 8 p.m., and then again Saturday, June 29th, starting at 8 p.m. However, we are able to let you know that on Friday, July 5th, the Rick Lewis Project will be performing there starting at 8 p.m. Head to Howlin' Wind Brewing, located at 51A Main Street in Rollinsville on Saturday, June 29th at 5 p.m. for the 3rd anniversary party of Howlin' Wind Brewing, featuring Magoo and the Jolly Jugs, with members of Rapid Grass, Stillhouse Junkies, Beauregard, and Slay and Stinson, including, but not limited to, Brett Kretzer, Matt Thomas, Andy Reiner, and James Armington. Also be sure to head there on Saturday, July 6th at 5 p.m. to see High Lonesome performing live. Coming on Thursday, July 4th is the annual Jamestown 4th of July celebration at Elysian Park in Main Street. Starting at 10:30 a.m., there's a performance from PJ Moon. At 12:30 p.m., Katie Farmer will perform the Star Spangled Banner. Then at 12:45, she'll switch out with Stellar J for the next performance. At 2 p.m., the Riverman Band will be performing live. At 3:15, Floon Dog will be performing live. At 5:30 p.m., Foggy Mountain Spaceship will be performing live. At 7 p.m., Riverspell will be performing live. And concluding the day, starting at 8:30 p.m., Porphyry will be performing live. Head to the Jamestown Mercantile, located at 108 Main Street in Jamestown, on Sunday, June 30th at 12:15 p.m. to see Davey and the Midnights performing live. On Wednesday, July 3rd at 7 p.m. for Shake It Like a Caveman. On Friday, July 5th at 7 p.m. to see the Brothers Burn Mountain performing live. And on Sunday, July 7th at 12:15 p.m. to see Ashley Kendall Priest performing live. Head to Knotted Root Brewing, located at 250 North Caribou Street in Netherland, on Thursday, July 4th, starting at 2 p.m. to see New Family Dog performing live. Also be sure to head there Wednesdays at 6 p.m. for an open mic night, and Sundays at 5 p.m. for Jazz Sundays. Head to the Netherland Farmers Market, located at 85 East 1st Street in Netherland, on Sunday, July 7th at 10:30 a.m. to see Riverspell Duo performing live. The location for this is currently to be determined, at least according to TimeServedProductionGroup.com, but be sure to keep an eye out on that website for the Netherlands Summer Concert Series event that's happening on Saturday, July 6th, starting at 4 p.m. with Banshee Tree and Benjamin Sproul Band. And finally, head to the Very Nice Brewing Company, located at 20 East Lakeview Drive, number 112 in Netherland, on Saturday, June 29th at 5 p.m. to see Steepland String Band performing live. On Sunday, June 30th at 5 p.m. to see Porphyry performing live. On Friday, July 5th at 6 p.m. to see Mad Dog Blues performing live. On Saturday, July 6th at 7 p.m. to see Derek Danzol performing live. And on Sunday, July 7th at 5 p.m. to see Ella Wren performing live. Did we miss you or any of your performances? Want to submit your music listing in the Peaks Peak area? Do you have updates to your business or any upcoming performances? Please call 303-810-5409 or email info@themountaineer.com or media@themountaineer.com to be included in the next print edition or the next podcast of The Mountain Ear. And now, to transition into our next guest. Do you mind introducing yourself real quick?
Hi, this is John McEuen. I'm here with Jamie. I spent over 50 years of my life with Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Jamie, what do you do?
I answered John that I was a student at CU Boulder with a major in creative writing and minors in music and cinema studies. I also, since I interviewed him, ended up taking a certificate in Native American and Indigenous Studies. If you want to learn more about me, though, since this interview is not about me, check out the Mountaineer Podcast, episode 35, for a spotlight on me from the Mountaineer intern, Brooke Perry. Now back to John.
What did you want to know today?
I wanted to talk to you today, John, because I heard that you were involved with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band in recording music at the Caribou Ranch.
That was in the 70s. We did some wonderful recordings up there. I did some recording up there that wasn't with the Dirt Band, too. When the Dirt Band was there, it was the epitome of rock and roll excess. You know, everybody had a cabin and food being served in a central place to eat between 8 and 10:30. We'd have breakfast. And it was like excess. Where's the bass player? Oh, he's on a horse. He'll be back in about an hour. You get back. Where's the guitar player? Oh, he went back to his room for a bit. And the places were all spread out. They weren't right on top of each other, the places where you'd stay. But it was wonderful. Where's John? He's up playing pool. You finally get to the studio to record, and you could be worn out. So much stuff and time and going on. But we did some really good recordings there. The piano was great, and the amplifiers were great, the headphones and everything.
What was your primary goal in going to the Caribou Ranch to record?
Trying to get as good a recording as we possibly could. But sometimes that would be inhibited by the fact that you were at 8,000 feet. And if you had a sax player playing something on the song that was good, and the lick went, well, he could only get enough air to go, because the air was so much thinner. And if you were a singer, you couldn't sing as much because the air was so much thinner. And if you were just anybody, you would tire out easily. But we did some recordings that were really good on the album called Symphonium Dream. And one of my favorite recordings was a new version of Battle of New Orleans. But some of my favorite recording up there was with Michael Martin Murphey. You familiar with him? Well, Michael Murphy had a song called Wildfire about a horse that ran away, and a song called Carolina in the Pines. And on Carolina in the Pines, I got to play the 5-string banjo with a solo that seemed to make an impression. I was glad of. I've had people tell me over the years that was a song that they started playing banjo for, and people that really liked it. It was a hit in 1978 or so.
Were there any memories or events that stuck out to you while you were recording at Caribou Ranch?
Well, it was a good place to have family members, wives, and I had a couple of my kids with me, and they were pretty small, and it was a nice thing to be there. It was only 45 minutes from where I lived over in Clear Creek County, Idaho Springs. Let's see, I lived in Idaho Springs or Evergreen? I think I lived in Evergreen. Yeah, at the time. And it was just really, you knew it was a unique spot. You knew that Jim Guercio was managing Chicago and playing with the Beach Boys. Jim Guercio owned it. He was a manager and a producer and a bass player. And he must have been a really good bass player because he played with a lot of people. And his brother, Jeff Guercio, was a wonderful engineer. He died in a hang gliding accident while we were up there. It was a tragic day. But going up to Caribou was always a wonderful adventure.
For the record, after some basic research, I found out that John McEuen actually lived in Idaho Springs for about 20 years, in Clear Creek County. He lived in Evergreen, California, from what I can tell, from 1971 to 1988, but not in Colorado. But tell us more about Caribou Ranch. How many times did you go up there?
I think 3. One time was for 2.5 weeks, one was for a week, and one was for maybe 2 days. Michael Murphy was rather short. We played on 3 or 4 songs. No, I think it was 4. Maybe I played on 2 of his albums and they were done there. Or did I do Cherokee Phil? No, I think it was 2 of his albums. Then everybody felt when you were at Caribou that you were making music that this might matter. This might get out there. This might be something that's on the radio. This is what you're doing and you're at the best place to be doing it. And it felt like you had to come up to its level.
What in particular felt special about the Caribou Ranch that was different about recording studios that you'd been to before?
It had the best mixing board combined with really great playback speakers and the right multi-track machines. Now, there was one of the problems, because you were in Netherlands at 8,000 feet, and if you had a problem with the capstan on the tape recorder where you weren't getting the head alignment right, we couldn't set it, you had to line tape then for playback and recording, and you had to adjust them every morning. If you had to have something worked on, you had to fly a guy in from Chicago, and that would take a day. And that happened 2 or 3 times while we were there, and it kind of slowed things down. But overall, they had the best equipment, meaning amplifiers, pianos, microphones, and space to be in.
Did you have material already written before you went up there, or did you go up there with the intention of writing stuff?
No, it was mainly going up there. We had stuff. We had to record. Let's go to Caribou. Okay, they got an opening. We'll take that one, and we'll go there and record. The Dirt Band was just recording where it could when it had material ready. We didn't write things which was maybe a mistake. We didn't write things because we had a studio day. But anyway.
Were you the only one who recorded with Michael Martin Murphy when he came to Caribou Ranch?
No, I think Charlie Daniels was on something. And Jeff Hanna was singing on something. And Jimmy Ibbotson, he lives in Woody Creek now. But he's the one that did the great version of Battle of New Orleans. And it was really one of my favorites.
And what felt special about Caribou Ranch compared to other studios of the time?
Because of the equipment that had been gathered in one spot. One place had everything you needed. You had the piano that was used on, I believe, Bridge Over Troubled Water. You had microphones that were the magic kind of microphones that would make you sound as good as possible. And then $20,000 microphones, as well as cheap ones, and you had a great mixing board and recording machine. And it was all in one spot. And it was great to have access to that. And you could have access to it if you were booked in there for 2 weeks. Nobody else was going to be coming in and moving stuff around. It was yours. And that led to excesses. That led to time being wasted. It led to somebody who's doing drugs and they go, oh, I don't know, man. I don't feel like recording right now. Maybe a few hours. And a few hours later, the other guy didn't feel like recording or whatever. It was just kind of difficult in that it was so good because it allowed you to be lazy. But it wasn't lazy all the time or whatever, but it was something that had to be dealt with. Somebody like Elton John would go up there and knock out a great record.
Was there any part of recording at Caribou Ranch that felt like you were on another level of recording studios?
No, it was like everybody was kind of equal. Paul McCartney didn't go there to record. That would have felt like something special. The people that were going there to record were just people at the same level that you were at, kind of. You're in the business, you're making records. This is a place you make good records. Oh boy, let's make some good ones. But people weren't legends yet, you know? John Denver wasn't a legend. He was still alive. He was only 3 or 4 years into his career. I don't think he recorded there. He might have. But Dan Fogelberg, he was pretty well known, but he was early in his career too.
Is there anything else in general you want to add?
It was nice to have a situation where you could spend an hour or two experimenting with something, trying to use a guitar different or maybe a banjo or doing something unusual with a lap steel guitar. It was just good in general. The thing about it being too easy, or let's see, what was the word I used? You could get lazy. Well, not everybody was lazy at once, and sometimes that would happen, but there's also periods of work where you would be sitting in the studio plugging away for 8 or 10 hours. It was a great place to be.
There's one more thing I wanted to ask you about your involvement at the Caribou Ranch. Of course, the studio ended up burning down in 1985. What was your reaction when you heard about that?
Well, that's convenient. My reaction was, well, it had been getting less and less business because of being at 8,000 feet and hard to fix things, and it seemed like it was a convenient fire. The important stuff didn't get burned. But I was sorry to see it happen. I would say I had heard that the important parts of the studio did not get burned, and they were very lucky about that. That's what I heard.
Thank you so much to John for coming on board and joining us for the podcast. Of course, there is so much of John McEuen's music that you can check out, particularly with his involvement with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band and the iconic album Will the Circle Be Unbroken? There is in fact a brand new book that is available on John McEuen's website, johnmceuen.net. You can purchase Will the Circle Be Unbroken at Landmark Booksellers, Amazon, Books A Million, and Barnes & Noble by going to that website. You can also pick up his autobiography, The Life I've Picked, A Banjo Player's Nitty-Gritty Journey, which was a best-selling book when it first came out. This interview was originally conducted on April 3rd, 2023. I wanted to get John on the podcast because I wanted to collect as many personal statements from people who were involved with Caribou Ranch as I possibly can, whether they were musicians who recorded there or whether they actually had a hand in founding the place. So, if you know anybody who was involved with Caribou Ranch, or you were somebody who was involved with Caribou Ranch, please reach out to me at media@themountaineer.com and we will sort out an interview with you because I would love to get your personal statement. If you're a musician who recorded there, maybe Elton John. If you were the founder, James William Guercio, I would love to interview you for the podcast and or for the paper. Please contact me at media@themountaineer.com and we will set something up. My own personal efforts have been mixed, to say the least. I managed to get John on the podcast, and I also happened to stumble upon another person who was at Caribou Ranch named Bobby Caldwell, who was the former drummer of a band called Johnny Winter, and also the drummer of a band called Captain Beyond. Other than that, I really haven't had much luck. I reached out to somebody from Emerson, Lake and Palmer who said that their time at Caribou Ranch was basically not memorable enough for an actual story. But that person got me in contact with the manager of Al Jardine of the Beach Boys. Unfortunately, he has not been able to sit down and answer my questions because, frankly, he's been busy with so much else, so who could blame him? But if you have time to actually sit down and do an interview with me and let me collect your personal statement about Caribou Ranch, I would love to interview you. So please email me at media@themountaineer.com and we will get that sorted as soon as possible.
I didn't know Vassar Clements was born in 1928 till I was writing an obituary on him. This story is about a young fiddler, and it was written in 1928. Could have been about Vassar.
The song that played in the ad break is called A Roving on a Winter's Night, and it's performed by Harry Tuft on vocals and guitar, Tim O'Brien on fiddle, mandolin, and bouzouki, and Pete Wernick on banjo. It is from the new Harry Tuft and Friends album called Treasures Untold. The song that you are currently listening to is a remastered edition of The Mountain Whippoorwill, performed by John McEuen from his brand new album The Newsman, A Man of Record, which includes 10 spoken word renditions of poems from the 19th and 20th century that McEuen has been collecting over the course of his 50-year career, as well as one self-penned instrumental, Jules' Theme, inspired by Jules Verne telling a friend in a French cemetery about his recently deceased young wife. You can stream this album wherever you get your music. And be sure to check out johnmceuen.net for more information about the legendary musician.
Up in the mountains, it's lonesome all the time. Up in the mountains, it's lonesome for a child. Whippoorwill's calling as the sap runs wild. I was born in the mountains. Lonesome born, raised running ragged with the cockaburs and corn. I never knew my pappy. Maybe I never should. I think he was a fiddle, made of mountain laurel wood. I never had a mammy to teach me pretty please. They told me she was a whippoorwill, a skipping through the trees. I never had a brother nor a whole pair of pants. But they used to say, they used to say, when he starts to fiddle, oh, you gotta start to dance.
And that's it for our show. Subscribe online to get more access to more news, weekly updates to our community calendar, and a link to our YouTube channel by visiting themountaineer.com. Be sure to use the coupon code PODCAST when subscribing for a 10% discount, only available to our listeners. If you are in the local Peak to Peak area, be sure to pick up a print edition of The Mountaineer at a local business. I'm Dango Rose. Thank you for listening.